Not once, but yes.
Hi, I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to Knock Once for Yes. It's a crazy old world out there right now. We talked about the current situation on the little bonus video we made recently. And if you haven't seen that, please do check it out on our YouTube channel. It's available to everybody. We'll be doing another catch-up for you guys in the future and chat about the current situation. But for today, we're not going to talk about it. We want today's episode to be a place of escape. Because while it is very important to talk about what's going on, it's just as important to get a break from it sometimes and let yourself have some respite and escape from the whole situation. So without further ado, what have we got coming up on today's episode, Fitz?
Coming up, the foos get confused by a spook in the studio. We've got listener stories from Cory and Liz. And don't worry, there are 3 stories. We've got 2 from Cory, so thank you, Cory. And you join us on our adventures into the supernatural as we share some insights and some recordings of our paranormal investigations so far.
But first, we want to say a massive thank you to our latest patrons.
Red,
Julie Richarm,
Miri Spraggs,
Mary Kate Harbinson,
Hayley Pearson Cox,
Cloda,
Shane Ashwind.
And thank you also to Thea Ellen for upping her pledge.
And we'd also like to thank those of you who made donations through Coffee.
Rhonda,
Samantha,
Sharon Whittington,
Corey C,
Annika Radio,
and a special thank you to Mira, who just blew us away with her incredible donation.
Thank you so much, guys. We honestly don't know what we'd do without you. It means the world to us that you're choosing to support us, continue to share this weird and wonderful journey with you all. And we're just unendingly grateful that you have our backs. Sincerely, thank you. Now, Fitz, what spooky treats have you got for me on today's Paranormal Radar?
Members of our Facebook group might be aware of this story, as Becca, a listener and member of the group, also spotted it and posted it there. I can see why it caught your eye, Becca, as it did mine, being a bit of a Foos fan. I found the story on NME, and I'll post a link in the show notes on the website as usual for you all to check out. But it looks like it was doing the rounds, as the story Becca posted was from Rolling Stone, so that's the one that you can find on our group. The story goes that the band The Foo Fighters were recording their latest album at a house in Encino, California, and Dave Grohl stated that as soon as they entered the house, they knew that the vibe was off, but they were getting the sound they wanted, so they forged on. At first, they found that after leaving the studio, they would return the following day to find their guitars detuned. Now, I own guitars. I would say that I play guitars, but that may be overstating my talent somewhat. But anyway, if you play guitar, you may be thinking to yourself, so what? That's hardly unusual. Sometimes you could be tuning a guitar several times a day. But it didn't stop there. Settings on their pedal boards would change, tracks would be missing from their recordings, and spookiest of all, there were additional tracks that they didn't record themselves. There wasn't any music or decipherable talking on the tracks, simply the sound of a mic left on in an empty room, but Dave did say rather enigmatically that something was happening. They were so convinced that someone was playing a prank on them that they set up some baby monitor cameras that they'd used, as one usually does, to monitor their babies. And at first they didn't catch anything, and were at the point of assuming that they were just imagining things, when they started to see things that they were unable to explain. And I'm so sorry to you all, but that's literally where this story ends. Apparently they had to sign a non-disclosure agreement as the owner's trying to sell the house, and they weren't able to say any more other than the activity continued to happen for the duration of the recordings. I am of course hoping that in the fullness of time they'll be able to reveal what happened, but for the time being, I might just have to pick up a copy of the album and have a listen to see if any of the strange tracks made it through to the final master.
Oh, it's so unfair to leave us hanging like that. I need to know what happened.
I know, I was exactly the same when I was reading that story. I was just like, no, I need to know. I was like, oh, you can tell me in private. It's fine. Like,
yeah, Dave Grohl, if you're listening, you could just pop us the tracks over. We won't share it with anybody.
We promise we won't release it unless you give us your express permission.
We know you're such a big fan of ours, obviously.
Oh, if only.
You never know. One day he might be a listener. You never know.
That would be awesome if he was. Well, seeing as Dave Grohl has left us hanging, we're going to have to go to our first listener story to get our spook on this time, and this one is from Cory.
When I was 7, my family moved to Springfield, a suburb of Philadelphia. The house was beautiful. A big blue Dutch colonial built in 1912 right in the heart of town. From the sunroom, you could look straight through the French door-flanked living room, through the entry and into the kitchen. The entry hall housed the large wraparound staircase with a thick wooden banister. My family's 4 bedrooms were on the 2nd floor, and the 3rd floor held former servant bedrooms, a full bath with an original claw-footed tub, and a 2nd master bedroom directly over the rooms belonging to my brother and me. This room served as our guest room and my dad's office, while one of the former servants' rooms became my playroom. Life in such a grand home would have been idyllic had it not been so frightening. Almost immediately after moving in, I began feeling uneasy. The basement was finished, but I never wanted to go down there. I was comfortable in the playroom, but I didn't like to be alone in my dad's office. I hated that 3rd floor bathroom. I heard noises coming from upstairs at night. Some could be written off as critters, as we did have the occasional rodent houseguest. But sometimes I would hear the floorboards creaking, as if someone was walking up there. I'm aware how cliché that was, and had it stopped there, I might have written it off. But then I started to see her. Her was an old woman, in a full-length dress, with her grey hair pinned up on top of her head. I never saw her straight on, but caught her walking by in my peripheral vision on multiple occasions. Often at night, I would get that awful feeling of not being alone and would fall into absolute terror. Well beyond the age I assume most children stop crying for their parents in the night, I would wake my mother with my tears, and she would try in vain to convince me that it was just my imagination. We lived in that house for about 5 years, and it was only after we moved out that my mum admitted she had seen her too. As I said, you could see from the sunroom straight into the kitchen, which is how, one night, when we were all in bed and my mother was alone, watching TV in the sunroom, she looked through the kitchen doorway and saw an old woman in a long dress with pinned-up hair. I also found out later that my little sister was having similar experiences. Several times through her bedroom doorway, she saw an old woman come up the stairs and head up to the 3rd floor. She too described the woman as wearing a long, old-fashioned dress with her hair pinned up on her head. My sister is 5 years younger than me, and being so little at the time, did not have the fear that I had. Considering how terrified I already was, I'm not at all surprised that my mother did not share either of the stories with me until after we'd moved. Fast forward 20 years, and my husband and I are now raising our children in Springfield, less than 5 minutes away from my old house. It's really a wonderful community with a small town feel and a rich history, about which I've always loved to learn. I've had friends refer to me as the historian, as both genealogical and historical research are among my favourite hobbies, and when given the opportunity, I will happily blather on about the significance of every old building in town. It was my love of local history that one day led me down a very exciting rabbit hole. As is not unusual, I was poking around on the local historical society's website and nerdily poring over the many old town maps they have available, trying to discern what families lived on which farms and how and when the various roads came through. I came upon a map from 1928, which delightfully outlined each residential property and was labelled with the property owners' names. And of course, my eye immediately went to my old house and to the name of its first owner. Out of respect, I will not give her full name here, but refer to her as Mrs. K. Wanting to know more about her, I popped over to one of my favourite research sites, findagrave.com, and easily located her burial site in Philadelphia. Okay, I thought to myself, Mrs. K must be our ghost. But I just wasn't satisfied with that. I couldn't reconcile Mrs. K's era with that of the woman I'd seen as a child. This woman had died in 1955, so it seemed unlikely that her ghost would be wearing a full-length dress, especially as an old woman. Findagrave.com is a wonderful research tool because it will not only give you an individual's burial information, it will also link any relatives who are buried in the same cemetery. So I could see that Mrs. K was buried with not only her husband, but her parents. A gut feeling began to form, and I clicked on her mother's name to pull up her burial information. Her mother, Mrs. R, had been born in 1844 in Boston, but had died in 1920 in Springfield. I called my mother and excitedly proclaimed, "I think I found our ghost." Together we logged into Ancestry.com, plugged her name into the search query, and located a census record from 1915. Sure enough, there were Mr. and Mrs. K, and living with them were Mrs. K's parents, Mr. and Mrs. R. A death certificate also revealed that our dear Mrs. R had died in the home. Mrs. R would have been 76 years old at the time of her death in 1920, which lines up perfectly with the look of the woman we saw. More than 20 years later, our ghost had a name. On reflection, I don't think that Mrs. R was ever aware that we were there. She never looked at us or interacted with us, merely walked by going about her own ghostly business. My father and brother never had any experiences at all, but my mother, sister and I have all had many unexplained experiences in the years since. I've always thought it was odd that only the women in our family were able to see her, and our continued encounters with the paranormal beg the question, did we see Mrs. R because we were open to it, or are we open to experiences because of our time with Mrs. R? This question is furthered by the second ghost of our old house, our old black Labrador who died when I was 8. Again, my mother, sister and I all saw her. This one I saw straight on, and even followed into a bedroom only to discover it empty. But the men of the family were left out. We only saw the dog for the first couple of years after her death. I like to think she stuck around to watch over us, until she decided she could trust our other dogs with a job. I drive past the old house occasionally, and while I'm sure my dog isn't hanging around anymore, I wonder if Mrs. R is still there. The same people have lived there since we left, and I don't know them personally, but it's a small town, so maybe someday I'll have the opportunity to ask them.
And thank you to Cory for sharing that story. You do raise some interesting questions that I'm quite keen on finding the answers out to myself. Like, why is it that only the women in your family saw anything?
And I feel like that ties into her other question about why are they seeing the ghost? Does the fact that they had this encounter with the ghost in the childhood home the reason that they then went on to continue having paranormal experiences, or were they just more open to it in the first instance and that's why they saw her? And I mean, it's a classic sort of age-old question that we'll probably never have the answer to. It's a chicken and the egg one. And I mean, certainly in my experience, you do tend to find that people who are open to the paranormal have more experiences. But that could simply be because they seek them out. I mean, we've had a lot of paranormal experiences. We are open to the paranormal, but we also go looking for it.
Possibly. I mean, it's not unusual to hear slightly different reports about the same thing. If you think back to the reports from Thetford Priory, you had one person that clearly saw a figure with wet spots, another person that vaguely saw the outline of a person, and another just saw a misty shape.
Yeah.
So,
although they all saw the same thing, they didn't actually see the same thing. They saw something all at the same time, but either the way their brains interpreted it, or their eyes interpreted it, or just the way they kind of...
Well, they had a sort of varying sensitivity to it. Yeah.
And it all came out in different ways. So maybe that's something to do with it. And especially if you're not very open to the paranormal and you're not sort of... you would call yourself like a non-believer or a skeptic. If you see something that's a lot more vague than the person next to you that saw a really clear figure, you're much more likely to write that off and just go, it was a shadow, it was the light, it was, this, that, or the other. And I suppose that plays into it a lot as well. If you class yourself as a believer and you're looking for something, you're much more likely to not write off something in your peripheral vision. You're much more likely to stop and think, oh, was that? Let me just really think that through, let me try and dissect what I just saw.
I'd also be interested to know if you do ever catch up with the new owners of the house. Having been in contact with sort of various people that have moved into paranormal locations after other people have lived there, it does seem that sometimes it does tend to tail off and stop. Other times it carries on, so...
I feel like sometimes it's the combination of a haunting that's already there and the people that are moving in, because you tend to find there are houses that I've heard of where you've had one resident there that has experienced something, the next one has experienced nothing at all, and then another one after that has experienced something again. So there's so many different variables there, and also how long does a haunting last? Does it just continue? In this case, it sounds like more of a residual haunting. She mentioned that it didn't seem to interact with the family, didn't realise they were there, so they're just kind of playing on a loop, a bit like the stone tape theory. So does that continue indefinitely, or does it fade?
Well, the one I was thinking about was my granny's old house, where all of our family had experiences. And apparently it changed hands quite quickly 2 or 3 times after that.
Really?
But now... some friends of the family or friends of my uncle's in-laws or something moved in, and they've had nothing.
Really?
Yeah, nothing at all.
Oh, that's strange. I just think it was amazing how you dug into the history and managed to find the name to go with the haunting. That blows my mind. I'm in awe of your history skills. I want to learn how to do that, because one of the houses, the first house that we lived in together, I've always wanted to go to the archives and dig up the history and see what we could basically do what you've done and try and kind of put some names and history together so we can figure out who was there and what was really going on. It's incredible.
Yes, that was some awesome detective work.
And that's not even all we've got from Cory today. She's actually sent us in another story. You may remember that recently I talked on an episode about an experience I'd had of my own. I was in a supermarket car park quite late at night in my car, and I felt and heard somebody run behind my car, only to turn around and find there was nobody around for miles. Now, when Cory heard this, it reminded her of an experience she'd had herself, and she got in touch to share that with us.
I live outside Philadelphia and was sitting on Route 30, also known as the Main Line. The area was very active during the Revolutionary War, with several battles nearby, as well as a massacre. Route 30 is a very old road, and I was at the light for the intersection of Sproul Road, which happens to be another very old road and also a very long light. I was listening to the Smashing Pumpkins on the radio, and suddenly I had the very distinct feeling that someone was standing next to my car and looking at me. I turned and looked around, but nobody was there, and the people in the cars next to me weren't paying me any attention. I was unnerved, but I turned my focus back to the traffic light and the music. A minute later, I heard and felt someone knock twice firmly on my car window. This time I jumped clear out of my seat and spun around, but again, nobody was there. Nobody could have gotten away that fast. We were in the middle of a busy intersection, and again, the people around me seemed completely oblivious to all of this, and you'd think that if someone was messing around with me in the road, someone else would have noticed. But there is no doubt that something knocked on my window. The whole car vibrated with the noise, and it's a very distinct, recognisable noise. It's one of the strangest things that's ever happened to me, and that's topping a fairly long list. As I drove away, I decided that if it was a ghost, I feel really sorry for them. Imagine trying to make contact with someone who can't stay and help you. As soon as the light turned, I drove off, and I'll never know what was trying to reach out to me. Poor ghost.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us as well, Cory. It does really remind me of my story. I can totally see what you mean because you heard it, you felt it. That's exactly what I had. And as you say, you know the sounds of your own car very intimately. I mean, we spend a lot of time in our car. Well, I certainly do anyway. Far too much time, unfortunately, commuting. And you know what it sounds like. You know, it has very distinctive sound. It's not going to be mistaken for something outside. It's just... How can you explain it? No. It's interesting you said about the connection to the battles, but then to have an interaction with such a modern object. And this is something we talked about with my experience as well, because the only history in the area where I had my experience is ancient history. And again, you've got an interaction with a very modern object. So how does that work?
No, it's weird. I mean, like you say, it does seem to be a definite action. If it was just one knock, you might be able to pass that off as a stone flicked up or something. But when it's two definite knocks, that kind of does imply that it was intentional, doesn't it?
Trying to get your attention, as you say, what a shame that maybe they want something. Oh, you just never know.
And she does conjure up this image of somebody like, help me, help me.
Yeah, I need something. I need to get something across to you. Oh, what a shame.
Give me a bit of a shiver, that one.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Cory, for sharing both those stories with us. And it sounds like you may have a few more to share, which we would love to hear if you ever felt like sending them in.
Yes, it certainly sounds that, like us, you do have more than your fair share of paranormal stories, and we would love to hear them. Well, now it's time for our last listener story of this episode, and this one is from Liz.
In a quiet village in East Northants, I clean for a family who live in a beautiful, large, old house. The oldest part of the house is over 300 years old. During my first meeting with the owners, I jokingly said, "Oh wow, you must have a few ghosts here." To which she replied, "We have 5 actually." Her husband stated that he did not believe in all that nonsense, and after living there for more than 20 years, he'd never seen a thing. Although I believe in ghosts, and the thought of actually being in a haunted house by myself worried me, I noticed they had a dog, which made me feel a little more at ease. Surely the dog would know if there was a ghost about. I also remember my granny always telling me, if the living hurt you, the dead can't. Which makes sense, I suppose. Unless it's a poltergeist. They wanted a cleaner for a few hours each week, and this I agreed to. My first few weeks there, everything was fine. And whilst I didn't feel anything spooky, I had at the back of my mind the 5 ghosts that were said to haunt the house. One day when I arrived, the lady asked me if I could clean the back cloakroom. The large old house is set in quite extensive grounds. It's a listed building, which means it has special protection on it. Tall sash windows, sweeping views across the open countryside, high ceilings with big open fires in most of the rooms. The house has 2 staircases. One, I imagine, was the main staircase. The other creeps around the back and is narrow and winding. Both meet on the same long corridor in the upstairs of the house. The back cloakroom is situated near the main staircase. Whilst cleaning the cloakroom, I suddenly felt the strangest sensation. It felt as if someone walked straight through me. Not that I've ever had anyone walk straight through me, of course, but a feeling of someone very, very close to my personal space. I didn't dare look up into the mirror in fear of seeing a mystery figure. The cloakroom has no windows, and this happened on a calm, sunny day in July. I didn't feel frightened, I just felt weird, and I wasn't sure what had happened. I carried on with my jobs as if nothing was wrong. A few weeks afterwards, I mentioned to the owner what had happened, and she said she'd often seen the figure of a young man wandering around and sitting at the bottom of the main stairs. Maybe it was him. Months passed until my second experience. The family dog was out with the dog walker. I saw her be collected and I chatted with the dog walker and said goodbye to the dog. I'd finished the main living room and was walking into the reception hall when I saw what can only be described as a dog animal thing run in front of me. It happened so quickly, I didn't even give it much thought until I got home that evening and really had a chance to think it through. But there was nothing else in the house and no bad feelings prior to it happening. Another time I was cleaning in the bathroom, and for a split second I saw what I thought was a pair of tiny feet walk past. Again, this all happened so quickly, I didn't even think it was real. Perhaps my subconscious just didn't want it to be real, especially as I was there on my own. Time passed and all was quiet, until one day I took the back stairs to reach the first floor landing. Imagine a long, narrow corridor with rooms off to the left and beautiful sash windows to the right. In the middle falls the main staircase. Right at the end of the long, narrow landing is the guest bedroom. Now, I've never enjoyed cleaning that room. It has a funny feel about it, and the odd time I've been in there, I've always felt like I'm being watched. It's weird, but I don't feel threatened as such. On this day, I stood at the opposite end of the corridor to the room, and I saw the figure of a lady sat on the bed. I can describe her quite clearly. She was wearing Victorian clothing and her hair was in a bun. This sounds so cliche, but that's what she looked like. She just sat there for about a second and then with a blink, she was gone. Oddly, having seen her, I didn't feel scared or the need to run away screaming. It's like I just accepted it and carried on. I didn't go near the room again though. A few weeks later, the son was staying at the house and I was just chatting to him about how beautiful the house is and how lucky he was to grow up there. He then asked me if I'd met the Grey Lady. Instantly, I got goosebumps and felt all cold. He said, "She just sits on the bed in the guest room. Loads of my mates have seen her, but I don't believe in all of that rubbish. When it was my sister's bedroom, she used to talk to her. It's all a load of nonsense." He then went on to tell me that legend has it that there was a murder years and years ago in the garden, and that the Grey Lady was the mother of the victim, and that's why she remains in the house, as she waits for them to return. To this day, I haven't been in that room to clean. And I keep those words of my grandmother in my mind. If the living hurt you, the dead cannot.
So thank you to Liz for getting in touch and sharing that story. It was nice to have a local one again for a change. Now, there were a couple of things that stood out to me to start with. The first one was, of course, I bet this place is haunted. Yep, loads.
And it sounds like the most amazing house.
And there was, of course, the husband's, I don't believe in all that nonsense.
Yeah, and isn't it, it's funny that we were just talking about that with the earlier story about the fact that you had a situation where only the women were seeing the ghosts. Maybe it's a similar thing.
This is it. I was going to say, it does sort of tie into Cory's first story, that it was interesting that some of them saw it and some of them didn't. And it was the son, I think, in this case, that
didn't believe either.
But his friends had seen it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, again, very interesting that it seemed to sort of lean more towards the females of the family that would see it. I don't know about the son's friends, but...
No, and this episode's kind of turned into a bit of a grey lady episode by accident.
There is a bit of a theme going on.
But it's interesting, Liz, that you say, it sounded so cliche. But the thing is, there's a reason for that cliche. Because a lot of times, that is just what it looks like.
Mm.
I mean, I've had experiences myself where I've been explaining them to somebody, and as I'm doing so, I'm thinking it just sounds like I'm making this up because it's so typical of what you'd expect a ghost story to sound like. But there's a very good reason that you expect that from a ghost story, because it happens a lot and it genuinely does happen. That's what it looks like.
And I certainly don't blame you for avoiding the spooky room in future.
No, I think I'd have been a bit hesitant to clean in there again myself.
Yeah, so thank you again, Liz. And that is all the listener stories we've got for you today. Thank you so much to everyone that shared their stories with us. And if you've got a story to share, please do get in touch through the website at notonceforYes.com. We are trying to get some extra content out there for everyone during the lockdown, and if we get enough stories in, we might just be able to do an extra stories only episode, which would be very cool.
But don't worry, we're not even nearly done yet for today. We've got a lot of catching up to do, lovely listeners. This episode has actually been about 8 months in the making, because over the last little while we've been dipping our toes into the world of paranormal investigating. We've been doing some experiments, and we're excited to be telling you all about it today. So as you probably know, we weren't complete strangers to the world of paranormal investigating. We'd been on some public investigations which really got us hooked. Fitz had already guested on an investigation with the UK Haunted team, and of course, we've got our own little haunting going on at home. But we're not part of an investigation team, and so we hadn't really been out in the field trying our own techniques and equipment. But last year we were lucky enough to be invited on a few investigations, one of which was by the wonderful team at the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre, who asked us to be a part of one of their investigations, which are live streamed for Haunted Antiques members to watch and interact with. We were so honoured to be asked, and very excited, as it was somewhere that we'd wanted to investigate ever since we first visited, and we had some things that we wanted to try.
Now, the kind of equipment you'll often see being used on paranormal shows can be pretty expensive, but we'd come up with some things we wanted to try that wouldn't break the bank. And one of the first things was something we'd come across being used on some of the ghost hunting events we'd attended. We've talked about it before, and although it seems an unlikely piece of ghost hunting equipment, we'd already had some very interesting and possibly paranormal experiences with cat toys. The cat toys we're talking about are motion-sensitive balls that light up when they're touched. We've all seen REM pods on paranormal shows, a little cylinder with lights and an antenna on top. The device radiates an electromagnetic field and can detect when something else with an electromagnetic field enters its space, at which point lights and alarms go off to alert investigators that something near it moved. For the musicians amongst you, it's a bit like a tweaked theremin. In a lot of ways, it's kind of one up from the good old classic EMF detector, because whilst these detect electrical fields, they can't pick up the EMF emitted by humans, but a REM pod can. If you wave your hand next to one, it'll alarm. And that's because it's detected the electrical current produced by your body. Unfortunately though, a REM pod, just like an EMF detector, is open to interference from non-paranormal sources such as mobile phone signals, Wi-Fi, walkie-talkies, or even camera batteries. Now don't get us wrong, using devices that detect EMF is interesting. We have an EMF meter ourselves, we love using it and it's produced some exciting results. But the advantage that our humble cat balls have is that they're only triggered by movement, and to the best of our knowledge anyway, can't be triggered by a stray mobile phone signal or anything similar. So if they go off, something moved, and if there was no one near them, nothing visibly moving and no wind or other atmospheric conditions to move them, then you've got yourself something unexplained. And these cat balls also aren't perfectly round. They have flattened sides, so they tend to rest in a certain position without rolling, provided the surface is flat. The first time we saw them being used, they were set up in a line across a room where we'd previously seen a shadow figure, which seemed to pass from one side of the room to the other. During the investigation, we placed the cat balls along the path the figure had taken, and they duly lit up in sequence in the opposite direction of the figure's travel, as if it had returned along the same route. We set them up in various rooms during the Haunted Antiques investigation, but they only went off in one room at one time, and that was when we were trying to communicate with a carved wooden statue known by the team as the Incondi. Despite not having gone off all night in the other rooms, and despite the fact that we set up 2 balls in 2 different places around this room, the only one that went off was the one we set in front of the wooden statue, and it only went off when we were asking questions directly to the statue. We even moved around to see if we could set it off with our own movement from our position at the other side of the room, but we couldn't make the ball light up. Wondering if this ball had just somehow become particularly sensitive, we didn't use it in the rest of the investigation, but made sure that it was on and within sight the whole time so we could see if it went off randomly, but it did not. We used the cat balls again on another investigation later in the year, and we'll tell you more about that shortly. This time we set up all 3 cat balls on a surface and left a camera recording all 3 of them for 40 odd minutes. You'd think that if they did in fact go off randomly, it would have happened at some point during that time, but none of them lit up even once during the recording. And yes, we really did sit and watch 40 minutes of cat balls not moving whilst we reviewed the footage. Another low-cost experiment we were very keen to try was using music as a trigger. This has been used by lots of investigators and lots of paranormal shows, so it's nothing new. But being so audio-centric ourselves, we could very well imagine the impact a familiar tune could have on a place, and the change it could bring to the atmosphere of a room. So we downloaded some tunes on our phones and played them aloud to the darkened room. It certainly increased the atmosphere for us, if nothing else. We'd deliberately chosen recordings that weren't subject to copyright restrictions, as this was being broadcast publicly, and so some of the music we were playing to the darkened room were scratchy, wavery, old gramophone recordings. It would almost have been enough to up the creep factor all on its own, but listening to it in the dark, surrounded by shelves crammed full of haunted objects, with the empty eyes of dolls and clowns peering out of the shadows at us, it felt like the beginning of a horror film. But unfortunately, apart from putting us on edge a bit, it didn't seem to evoke a response from any nearby spirits. Maybe it would have worked better if we'd used more well-known songs. I'm not sure, but it's an experiment that fascinates me and I'd like to keep trying. I know we have quite a few listeners who are paranormal investigators, so maybe some of you that have had more success with using music as a trigger, could you let us know? We'd love to hear about it. But perhaps the most amazing part of that investigation for us was the experiments we did in the seance room at the Haunted Antiques Centre. But to explain how we got to this point, we need to back up a bit and talk about our first proper investigation of the year, when we were invited to join an investigation with the ghost detective and his team. If the name seems familiar, it's because we interviewed Adrian Perkins, better known as the ghost detective, back in 2018. We'll put the link to his website in the show notes for you to check out, as he's written an amazing collection of books on the paranormal. He's a brilliant author and a fantastic investigator, and we were absolutely honoured to be invited on one of his investigations.
We were also pretty nervous. Well, I certainly was anyway. We have a lot of respect for Adrian's work and felt we had a lot to live up to being allowed into this investigation. Our lack of experience in the field at the time worried me, as did the fact that we had barely a scrap of our own equipment to our names. We've never really been bothered about collecting tons of paranormal equipment and have largely been of the opinion that the best instrument for detecting ghosts is yourself. I'd never had a reason to feel shy about expressing my own intuitive feelings about a place, since it had only been Fitz and myself, and of course we trusted each other implicitly. But suddenly being a part of a team who I didn't know that well, and who had no reason to trust my instincts, well, I began to feel a little naked without a few gadgets to back up my intuition. I needn't have worried though, as it turns out that investigations really aren't just like you see on TV. As I'm sure any investigator will tell you, there is a lot of sitting and waiting. And although that may sound boring, and it certainly wouldn't come across well on TV, it's actually not boring at all. Whenever I watch paranormal shows, I've always rather disliked the quick-fire sense of urgency to investigations that comes across on the screen. Of course, I understand that production companies need to keep the story moving, but it just doesn't do much for me. I'm left wanting more of a feel for the place that's being investigated. I want to get to know it. I want to sit quietly, waiting out the sunset to see how the mood of a place changes as the light fades. I want to get familiar with the creaks and pops of the floorboards, the settling noises of the building, so that I can tell if something sounds out of place. I want to soak in the atmosphere so that I can tell if something changes, so that I can feel if there's a sudden tingle of electricity that wasn't there before. And this is the privilege of working on a real-life investigation. A privilege doubled when you're working with experienced investigators and have the opportunity to learn some of their techniques and experiments. One technique introduced to us on that first investigation caught me by surprise, as Adrian introduced us to his Emr experiment, or extended memory recall. As we all sat quietly, he gently talked us through a relaxation exercise to help us enter a calm, almost meditative state. The idea was for us to try and connect with the space we were in as it once had been, almost passively, to simply allow images, thoughts, feelings, words or names to pop into our minds. Not questing for specific information, we were given no questions or to ask or clues as to what we might find, and none of us knew the history of the room we were in. We were just to allow any information to flow through our minds without restriction or bias. I'd never done anything like this before, and I could only imagine the nonsense that my brain would throw up. I was really nervous when reporting back what imagery had come to me, thinking that it would of course be just so much nonsense from my own psyche. So imagine my surprise when it turned out that another member of the group had seen the same thing as me. And that wasn't an isolated incident either. Other members of the team had seen similar things too. It was intense, and I was a bit floored. My logical brain threw up cautions. There could have been something about the room that hinted to a purpose that had come through in our mind's eye, perhaps. It didn't seem like it, though. It was just an empty room, and we'd seen some pretty specific things that didn't seem to tie in with any of the surroundings. Neither were they things that had come up in conversation that night. The other consideration was whether what each of us had seen was coloured by listening to the retelling of others, as we went around the group recounting what we'd seen. Our brains are easily influenced after all, even if we don't want them to be. So the next time we tried this experiment, on a different day, at a different location, we all silently wrote down our experiences before discussing them with the rest of the group. This way, we had no opportunity to influence one another before recounting our experiences. Once again, to my surprise though, we got matching experiences between group members. And between all of us, related some of the history of the location, which none of us knew anything about prior, with frightening accuracy. After we had all shared what we saw, the owner of the property shared some information with us that we couldn't possibly have known, but had been reflected in what we had each seen during the Emr experiment. This was all way outside what I'd expected from a paranormal investigation, but I couldn't ignore the results, and I was fascinated. I wanted to do more with the experiment, but I found that when I was put on the spot in a group of people, I found it really difficult to relax enough to take part effectively. In the silent room, I became acutely aware of the sound of my breathing, or my stomach rumbling, until I was trying so hard not to make any noise that I just became really tense and trying not to move or breathe. Of course, this is the exact opposite of what I needed to do. So I started thinking. During meditation, people listen to music. It would help to have some noise to take away that awkward silence. But I hate the sort of music that we would usually associate with meditation. And with my anxious brain, I find actual meditation nearly impossible. I figured out that I needed to put myself into a state of slight sensory deprivation to be able to relax into the experiment. After trying a white noise app on my phone through headphones, and one of those travel sleep masks to block out some of the light perception you get even through closed eyes, I finally felt comfortable enough to breathe deeply and let the images flow.
And it was at this point that we realised we had just unwittingly recreated the technique used by Elle from the Netflix series Stranger Things to access her powers of ESP and remote viewing. It was entirely unintentional, and we had a good chuckle about it. It was pretty hilarious how we bumbled around trying to find a way to achieve a meditative state, only to find that a TV show had beaten us to the punch, and we still jokingly call it the Stranger Things experiment. But after we dusted ourselves off and realised that we weren't exactly breaking new ground after all, it also occurred to us that the show itself may well have been drawing upon a famous experimental psychology technique used in the 1970s called the Gansfield Experiment. Participants in the experiment, conducted by parapsychologist Charles Oniton, were blindfolded using goggles made from halved ping-pong balls and fed white noise through headphones to achieve a state of sensory deprivation, which could invoke hallucinations, or some thought achieve a state in which they were open to receiving images sent mentally by another participant. Oniton was trying to prove the existence of extrasensory perception. The Gansfield experiment brings us rather neatly to another, more modern experiment that wasn't a million miles away from what we were doing, the Estes Method. I'm sure most of you will now have seen the Estes Method in action on TV. Typically, it consists of one investigator asking questions whilst another is blindfolded and hooked up to an SB7 spirit box through noise-cancelling headphones. The headphones mean they can't hear the questions being asked, and the blindfold means they can't read the lips or expressions of the person asking the questions. It also must allow a level of sensory deprivation. The technique was invented by Carl Pfeiffer and Connor Randall during their investigations of the Stanley Hotel in web series Spirits of the Stanley, and was named after Estes Park, Colorado, where the Stanley Hotel is located. The experiment resulted in some pretty mind-blowing evidence, and soon began to be picked up by other investigators, maybe most notably Amy Bruni, Adam Berry, and Greg and Dana Newkirk. And the technique has become well known in paranormal circles since it featured in Travel Channel's Kindred Spirits and Planet Weird's Hellier. Like most paranormal enthusiasts, we've been fascinated by the results from the Estes Method and had for a long time been desperate to try it for ourselves. But when we eventually came face to face with a real-life spirit box, it wasn't quite the experience we were hoping for.
For me, my main problem was that I couldn't bear the noise. A spirit box sweeps rapidly through radio stations, producing a cacophony of white noise with snippets of music and voices from the radio station it sweeps through. I'm very oddly oversensitive to noise. I don't know why, but I can find certain sounds physically unbearable, and it turned out that this, unfortunately, was one of them. It made me so uncomfortable it was all I could do not to leave the room. There's nothing paranormal about this. Certain types of music have the same effect on me. I guess it's just the way my brain processes sound. It's probably also the reason that the music that sounds to fits like a jackhammer in a washing machine I find quite calming and enjoyable, but hey, we're all different, right?
For me, it threw up some different questions. To don my skeptic hat once again, I'm quite happy to entertain the hypothesis that spirits or ghosts or whatever they are could affect radio frequencies, and therefore playing different frequencies of radio static might be something that they could communicate through. Surely this would mean that some frequencies would be easier than others to communicate through. So why then would we keep moving the frequency around all the time? Surely that's like asking them to jump on a moving train. So with all this in mind, and left as we were with our EMR Come Stranger Things experiment, the next natural leap for us was, well, if we didn't use a white noise app as the background noise, what if we used a real radio tuned to white noise? What if we combined the Estes Method and the Emr Experiment, but using just a single frequency of white noise? That way, if there's a particular frequency that made it easier for a spirit to communicate through, maybe we could find it. And if we did hear anything through the headphones, then it couldn't be our minds interpreting a snippet of radio speech or music, because there shouldn't be any coming through. We would be tuned between stations, and not on a frequency that anyone was broadcasting on. So, having meandered into this very non-scientific and half-formed experiment, we went out and bought a good old-fashioned non-dab radio. Of course, we weren't the first people to try using white noise to hear spirit voices, and we'll talk more about that later. We knew it must have been done before, but we didn't know any specifics, and had no idea if anyone had tried exactly what we were planning to do. For the time being, we were happy to continue with our intuitive exploration without researching what others had done. There's a freedom sometimes in not knowing, and it was nice not to feel restricted or be biased by the experiments of others before us. We couldn't afford the prohibitively expensive noise-cancelling headphones required as part of the Estes Method, but discovered that wearing a pair of full headphones over the top of earbuds meant that you couldn't hear anyone talking anyway, as long as the white noise was turned up to a decent volume. And it was this experiment that we conducted in the seance room at the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre. Neil has very kindly given us permission to share with you the audio recording that we made of the live stream, and we're going to play that for you now. I'll apologise in advance for the yelling during the experiment, but when you're wearing two sets of headphones, not only can you not hear other people talking, but you also can't hear how loud you're being. You'll also hear Neil in the background reading out some of the live stream comments.
So we're trying an experiment with just a bog standard radio. And we're turning it into a bit of a sensory deprivation experiment. So we're going to have a blindfold. We could probably take it in turns, but I'm going to be plugged in through earphones with headphones over the top so I can't hear any questions that are being asked. And then I'm literally just going to kind of tune in to an empty radio station, just listening to white noise with nothing in it, and see if I can pick up anything intuitively or see if I hear anything. We've tried this at home and we've got some responses via sort of clicks and pops. Mm-hmm. that seemed to be responding to questions. Fitz, you also heard some other stuff.
Yeah, when I did it, it sounded like start with a train. Initially, it just started like ordinary static, just the plane, and then it's sort of built up until it sounded like a train. And I could almost hear sort of conversation in the background as well. But then I started getting clicks and pops, which later I found out seemed to be in response to the questions Lil was asking. And then at one point it sounded like machine gun fire. It was literally da 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 da.
Yeah, so it's been an interesting experiment so far. We tried it again another night and we didn't feel any energy. We got absolutely nothing.
No.
So that was more interesting actually, because the second time we tried the experiment we didn't hear anything at all. There was no clicks, no pops, no gunfire.
The first time we did it, it was interesting because all of a sudden it all just stopped and went to ordinary static, and we both felt like it had stopped.
You could tell the difference.
When we tried again, there was nothing. We weren't getting any of the clicks and pops. We weren't getting anything else that felt unusual.
No.
And there was a definite sort of change in the feeling.
Yeah.
It was quite odd.
It was very
So
noticeable.
yeah, I'm intrigued to see with everything that's here.
Exactly.
Whether we'll get sort of any clicks and pops or anything perhaps a little bit more dramatic than that.
Yeah. Right, I'm going to plug in it. I'm going to try and find a station. So.
Okay. Right. Can you hear me at all while I'm talking? A reasonable volume?
I'm hearing footsteps walking on gravel.
Okay, that's interesting, seeing as there's no gravel around. If there's anybody here that's trying to communicate, could you make the radio click or pop? Or perhaps say something?
Now I'm hearing somebody opening a front door.
A front door? Well, we've been hearing doors here, which is interesting. Could you make a knocking sound? You've been making knocking sounds here.
Postman?
A word? Okay, so I don't think we've had words through before. That's interesting. And are you a postman? Were you a postman? It sounds like you can communicate with words. Can you say yes or no? Can you give us a name? I thought I heard something moving back.
Yeah.
Is that you that's making the noises in the other room?
Oh, I can hear voices, but they're not. I can't make out words. Oh. Okay, the static just completely dropped out and went silent for a second and then came back. It's never done that before.
Okay, that's unusual. Can you do it again? Can you make it go quiet?
It just happened again.
Okay, that's interesting. Can you do it twice in a row to prove that it's you that's doing it?
Like it says vicar entering the church.
It just happened again. And again.
That's twice in a row. This is pretty interesting. Okay, I'm trying to think of something else to ask. Can anyone think of anything to ask?
Does he belong to the building, or does he belong to? Well, does he belong to the building?
Okay, it went. Yeah, it happened again. And again.
So you belong.
And again.
So you belong to the building rather than an object.
So it says it's an old game. Knock knock. It's the postman. It's a scary game.
Or are you attached to one of the objects? Were you here before this was a museum? Or have you arrived more recently? hearing something over by the mirror. Is it you that's making noises in this room as well? Are you making tapping noises here?
I'm not getting anything anymore. I feel like whatever it was has gone or got bored of me.
That was really interesting.
Was it? What happened? So there we go, and apologies, I know there were a lot of sort of dead, silent spaces in that, but we didn't want to cut it. We wanted you guys to get sort of the full experience and to see that there aren't just clicks and pops and things and static bursts going off all over the place. There are really long periods where literally nothing happens, which is why it's so interesting when something does. But to explain a bit more about what I was experiencing during that session, I didn't get the actual word postman through, sadly, although we have had words through in other experiments. But the sounds I was hearing was that of somebody walking, changing direction and gait, and then pausing and making noises as though they were opening a front door with a key or maybe fiddling with a letterbox. Then they would move off and repeat the process. This is why I thought postman, because it seemed a little like a postman's routine. And it's become very clear to us that we need to not only listen with this experiment, but also make note of the impressions or images we may get during the session as well, and we'll expand on that in a bit. As our investigation in the seance room went on, we tried different methods, including experimenting with some dowsing rods. We're not going to get into that much here because there's a lot that needs to be considered when using these tools, including the obvious idiomotor movement. And this could almost fill an entire episode by itself, so we might have to save that for another time. We'd both previously more or less discounted dowsing rods until having had some pretty interesting experiences with them firsthand, and I was interested enough to test the waters with them again. And between the dowsing rods, our own senses, and the input from those watching the live stream, we had some pretty surprising results. Things were thrown up that we definitely were not expecting. Having travelled out of county to a building chock full of haunted artefacts, we were prepared to encounter all sorts of entities from the many objects in the building, and even the building itself. But what we weren't prepared for is that all the communication we were receiving seemed to point towards the fact that the person we were talking to was actually the apparition we'd been seeing in our own house. Details came up that we hadn't discussed with anybody. Some people participating in the live stream picked up on items that we had on display belonging to the family member we had for a while now suspected to be behind the haunting, and there's no way they could have known this. Somebody even picked up on the fact that one of these items was missing, a uniform patch or badge. This was unsettlingly accurate, and will be an important detail to remember when we get to a later experiment. Of course, it's very difficult in a situation like this to remain unbiased and not be overwhelmed by a sense of wonder. It's easy to put skepticism aside and just trust in and accept your experience. Skeptics would argue that there are any number of ways that what we felt at the time to be mind-blowing revelations could simply be guesswork, interpretation, or just coincidence. And I'm not going to argue that they're wrong. Most of the time, I would consider ourselves firmly amongst those skeptics. But at the end of the day, you're left with a personal choice, whether to question or accept your experience. And for most people, that answer will vary depending on the situation and context. I think we settled on a mixture of slightly baffled amazement. We would never presume to tell you one way or the other is right or wrong. We only know that since we started this podcast, we've discovered that the world is a much, much weirder place than even we thought, and that we've seen and experienced things that science as we currently understand it doesn't yet seem able to explain. The Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre are doing some absolutely amazing work in the field So please do pop on over to their website and check them out if you get a chance. We'll put the link in the show notes. And if you're interested in becoming a member and getting access to all of their live streams and loads more member perks, you can do so for only £25, and we think it's worth every penny. Of course, like all of us in the UK right now, they're currently on lockdown, but they're still producing awesome online content from their own homes via their social media, and they're doing a sterling job of keeping all of us paranormal enthusiasts from going stir crazy during the isolation. So bearing in mind all these revelations about who we suspected was behind the haunting in our own house, I think that Fitz should tell you a little bit about who we think might be our resident spirit, or as we like to call him, Jack.
So I'm sure I've mentioned Jack a few times over the course of the podcast, but I can't quite remember exactly what I've told you all, so I shall give you a quick potted history. Whilst it isn't my very first ghost story, it is the one I'm most familiar with. It all began, if I remember correctly, after we moved to a new house when I was about 7 or 8. The house itself was built on the edge of the village, just outside the old village boundary wall, which was in fact our boundary wall with our closest neighbour, and had only one previous owner who had had the house built. The land was previously farmland and no one had died in the house. Being quite new, it had very little history at all. It was quite strange then when we began having paranormal activity almost straight away. My parents had a patio laid outside of the kitchen French doors to the rear garden, and one of the builders working on the job, a big Australian chap, not apparently one to be easily frightened, kept thinking my dad was behind him, but when he turned to look, there was no one there. After a few repeats of this, he downed tools and left, never to return. He wasn't the only person to be afraid of the activity. A family friend who strangely had a passionate interest in the paranormal was regularly freaked out by it, even though the activity itself was pretty innocuous. The activity was almost entirely outside the house, and we all had slightly different experiences. I would see a figure in blue walking around the house. My dad would tend to see a figure in blue standing underneath a plum tree in the garden, mostly when he was mowing the lawn, and my mum would see a figure in blue stood leaning up against the gatepost in the evening or during the night. There were, however, a couple of things that both we and any guests would experience. We would all see someone dressed in blue walking up the drive towards the front door. From almost anywhere on the ground floor, you'd be able to see through a window overlooking the drive. If you were sitting in the living room or at the kitchen table, you'd be able to see the person in blue approach the front door and then vanish. Oh, if I had £1 for every time someone said that someone's coming to the door or you've got a visitor and then nothing, I'd have a decent sized savings account. As well as this, the letterbox would also slam loudly. It was a pretty stiff letterbox and it rested in a notch, so you had to lift it up vertically a little before opening the flap. It could be the calmest day and you'd be sitting in the kitchen table eating dinner when you'd hear a bang of the letterbox and there was no one there. Thinking back on it now, it only ever seemed to happen when we were able to see the letterbox, so pretty much only when we were sitting around the kitchen table. I don't remember it happening at any other time, and you may find that this rings some bells from Lil's recording from Haunted Antiques. Now, I've mentioned that a few people were scared by all this, but strangely the whole family seemed to find it quite comfortable. I know personally that I always felt comforted by it, much like I had a friend around. This was especially apparent when I was home alone, and particularly at night, when seeing a flash of blue walking around the house would provide reassurance that I was protected. It was my mum that suggested that it was her Uncle Jack, as the feelings we had when the activity occurred seemed positive, and when we compared notes, we all seemed to agree that not only was the figure dressed in blue, but seemed to be wearing something akin to an RAF greatcoat. And Jack had been in the RAF during the Second World War, sadly dying in the conflict. After this, we all began calling our resident ghost Jack. We never really did anything further than this other than to keep each other informed of when we'd seen him, and this happened for years, for me at least, until I moved out. Jack was still there though and was seen regularly, and when I moved back with Lil to save up for a deposit on a house, Lil had her own experience.
The very first time I stayed over at Fitz's childhood home, I had no idea they had a ghost. He hadn't told me anything about this in advance, so I had absolutely no warning. And it was a very strange experience too. I'd gone down to make coffee in the morning, and in the kitchen I was standing at the counter, with behind me there was the French doors leading out onto the garden. As I was making the coffee, I felt and heard somebody walk in the French doors behind me. Of course, this was a strange house to me. There were other people in it, so I didn't really think anything of it. I simply turned round, and as the figure passed behind me, down the corridor to the hallway, I turned to say hello. But by the time I'd followed the figure's path until I was facing the hallway where it had gone, I realised there was nobody there. At all. The French doors weren't open. In fact, couldn't have been open because they were locked and the curtain was drawn, so I don't know how I saw somebody coming in them, but there was definitely no one there, and I just said good morning to an empty house. However, it hadn't set any of my own personal paranormal radars tingling whatsoever. As far as I was concerned, this felt just like any other person. Just like anybody feels when somebody walks up close to them and you just sort of sense that there's another person there. It wasn't cold and tingly or electric-y, it just felt warm and like a presence in the room. So I went upstairs with a coffee and I said to Fitz, "I've just had the strangest experience. It's almost like I saw a ghost, but it didn't feel like that at all." And he said to me, the oddest question, "What colour was it?" And I said, "Blue." And then it occurred to me that that was the only image that I'd got. I couldn't have made out features. All I could tell you was that whoever had walked behind me was wearing blue.
It was an interesting one because, as far as I'm aware, it's the only time anyone's ever seen him indoors.
Yes, we did have a friend stay over one night, and we were all sitting in the kitchen eating, and he saw Jack as well. It wasn't in the house, it was quite a classic sighting, I suppose you'd call it. I could see him looking out the window, and I followed his eyes, and I saw the expression on his face change to one of just confusion, and I said, "What did you just see?" And he looked at me and he just went, "Blue." And he'd just seen a figure in blue walking around the patio outside the kitchen windows, which was very interesting because, again, we honestly had not told him anything about this before he'd visited.
No, and that's pretty much identical to what I would tend to see. I'd be stood at the kitchen sink or like making a coffee or something, and I'd see walk past the kitchen window or walk past the living room window. So he got exactly what I used to get.
Mm-hmm.
So long story short, Jack was still there at least up until the point that we moved out to move into Coffee HQ. And when we got to Coffee HQ, we found out that we had no activity whatsoever. Coffee HQ was quiet as a tomb and not a haunted one. In fact, the very first weekend we were there, I was surprised to hear absolutely nothing going on outside. No cars, no people. It was silent. I even switched on the news to see if there was some kind of global apocalypse, but no, people are just pretty quiet on the weekends around here. And we had absolutely no paranormal activity here for quite a few years, until a little while ago when we started seeing shadow figures. Luckily, these didn't seem as scary and oppressive as the ones at the first house we lived in, and we kind of assumed that we'd triggered it by starting the podcast and visiting haunted locations. It certainly did seem to be more active around the times we were going on our adventures, but that may have just been that we were more aware of it because of what we were doing. As the activity had been happening inside the house rather than outside, I didn't immediately associate the activity here with Jack, but we kept hearing the letterbox flap, and it had never done so here before, unless you're putting post through it, obviously. And I'm not sure when it registered, but we were trying to remember when the activity started, and it seemed to coincide with when my mother brought round an old picture of Jack and some of his things. It was only then that the combination of activity twigged, and that we began to suspect that it was Jack.
So after the investigation at Haunted Antiques, when we were listening back through our audio, the penny dropped as to what I might have been hearing during my sessions with the Stranger Things experiment. As we've just said, most of the times that Jack was seen or experienced at Fitz's mum's house, he was outside, standing guard at the gate, watching from underneath the plum tree, walking the perimeter of the property almost like a watchman, and just seen as a blue-coloured blur of movement passing outside the windows. And then there was all the times he walked up and slammed the letterbox. And it got me thinking about what I'd heard. Footsteps on gravel, walking up to a front door, and moving the letterbox.
It certainly did seem to tie in to the experiences we'd been having.
So was that what I'd been hearing after all? Jack making his watchful circuit around the house, walking up to the front door, and flapping the letterbox. The next time we tried the Stranger Things experiment was on another fantastic investigation with the ghost detective Adrian Perkins and his team. We can't actually tell you much about this investigation or its location just yet. It's all top secret and under wraps for the moment. But he's kindly allowed us to share the audio from our radio experiment with you today. And we're going to play that for you just now. Be aware that we've beeped out a couple of words during the experiment to maintain the anonymity of the location. But it was following this experiment that we realised just how important it is for us to vocalise not only what we're hearing, but also what we're feeling and any impressions or images that we may be getting. Take a listen.
I'm still kind of learning, you know what I mean? It's-
Can you hear that? Yeah.
What the hell was that?
You have to look up.
Is that something falling or growling or what?
I just had like a bang.
That's the door.
So at this point, I had donned the headphones and the blindfold, and I tuned to a station, and I wasn't getting anything. And I didn't know that basically everyone had heard a noise out in the corridor outside and gone. So I was kind of sat there thinking, I'm not getting anything. They're going to poke me on the shoulder in a minute and tell me there's nothing happening. You know, you're boring everybody. Come on, let's do something else.
But of course it was very interesting in itself that Fitz was getting no responses, because what he didn't know was that nobody was asking questions.
Another interesting point is that they're just about to come back in the room, and that's when the activity starts.
Kind of feels like it's winding up to something. I've got a high-pitched noise that's just getting, like sort of
I think it was just them downstairs.
Okay.
I think my friend's helping me, like she's really good. But
Fitz has already started, by the way.
I tend to overthink them and take too long reading them. Do you know what I mean? Rather than just go like da 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 da.
Yeah.
So.
I don't know how close you are to me, but I just felt a breeze in my face.
That was me. Okay, so if there's anybody here with us tonight, we're hoping that you're going to be able to speak to Fitz through the headphones. So what we're playing on the headphones is some white noise.
It's getting louder and high intensity in my left ear, which is weird because as far as I'm aware, this is a mono signal.
It is a mono signal. If you're affecting the white noise in Fitz's ears, could you just do it again for us to confirm that was you? If you're just trying to figure out how to make it work, that's cool. Just play around with it a bit and see what you can do. We're hoping to be able to hear you through.
Very loud and intense now.
Okay. That's interesting.
I really appreciate what you're doing. You may not have done any of this before, realise you're able to do this, and you're just trying to speak to us, so continue doing whatever you're doing. I was wondering whether you were downstairs earlier. in the
anonymous location.
I just got a kind of
That's brilliant. If that's how you can respond to us, then that's great. Could you do it again so that we know that that's you saying yes?
When?
So the more you try, hopefully the more we'll get and we'll be able to communicate. So thank you.
Oh, feels like it was building up to something, and then it sort of, almost like when a turbocharger kicks in or something, it sort of wound up and then poof, and then got louder again.
How many fingers am I holding up? Just as a little experiment, we'd love you to answer, please.
I just got a weird... You know when you're on a plane and your ears pop?
Yeah.
But in one ear?
That's what happens when there's spirit near me. My ears pop.
Can you see how many fingers I'm holding up? If so...
You know?
Well, no, I know. My fingers.
Is that like words you can actually
Can
hear?
you tell me how many fingers I'm holding up, please?
So you can hear somebody saying,
Just to
you know.
confirm that it's you.
Can I have a go at that after?
Just for the camera. How many fingers am I holding up?
It's kind of doing it in reverse now. It's going from high pitch to a lower pitch.
Are you happy speaking to us, or are we annoying you? Oh, pressure in my ears is really bad.
It pulsed quite loud twice just then.
When you said pulse, I felt two like pulses on the back of my chair, which is weird.
Are we in your way? Are you trying to do your work and like we're in your way and that?
Are you standing behind me and Tess?
That's someone walking.
Is that one of us walking then?
It started walking and then it stopped. Yeah. That was creepy first.
Can you tell me who's outside?
As you can hear, pretty much everyone heard something going on outside the room, so almost all of them left and left me on my own again.
That seems to have just settled down into a sort of fairly level thing now.
It was just myself and one other person, and it had all gone quiet when they'd left the room.
Is there anyone else here that would like to speak to us?
And as you can hear, they started coming back into the room, but there was another 2 members of the investigation team that came in with them.
Having a crack at table, to be honest.
It just like perked up, like it had sort of settled down into a level tone, and it just sort of and
Did somebody just
had
walk
this
in?
excited feeling.
Is there somebody particular in this room that you want to speak to? Somebody that maybe just came back in the room?
Liz and Steve just walked in when that happened.
Oh, it just pulsed really loud then, and it kind of, it's like really strong. I'm just getting like affirmation, and it went,
So,
Okay.
is it Lewis or Steve you want to speak to? One of those two? Maybe not. Somebody else?
Do you want to talk to Steve?
kind of sounded a little bit like a scream.
Ooh. Okay.
Because you're giving us sensory reactions to it, we can't fully understand if you're trying to say something to us, so we're almost going to have to...
Click?
There's a click in the room as well.
I know.
There was a click.
Yeah,
As he said,
and
click.
they came about there.
Yeah.
So for us to understand, you're going to have to give us like signs, whether it's through fits and the white noise or clicks. So, can you make a sound either on the left or right hand side of the room to show us where you are?
By this point, the 2 extra members of the team that had come in a minute ago have now left, and it's just the original group.
Have the people that you wanted to speak to left the room again?
If he goes flat, then they've followed.
I think it's gone.
Are you serious? I know. Oh God.
Okay. Fitz, you're amazing.
It's not very often I get called amazing. Thanks, Alex. And speaking of, a couple of the other voices that you could hear there were Alex and Corin of Liqueur Paranormal, who are paranormal investigators in their own right, and they have some pretty interesting stuff themselves, so we'll link to their channel in the show notes for you.
Listening back to this recording, one thing that we started to realise was that there is often a delay between us asking a question and a response coming through. And we need to remember to leave ample time for a response, because in this instance, sometimes we were trying to ask another question before we'd allowed enough time for the first response to come through. So that's a lesson for us for the future. And the reason we discovered that it was so important to voice our impressions as well as what we're hearing is that when Fitz responded to the question, "How many fingers am I holding up?" as well as hearing the words, "you know," which of course we all thought was hilarious, what he didn't tell us at the time was that he was also getting the impression of counting. Now, if he'd said this out loud, it would have blown our socks off, because of course he couldn't hear the question. Unfortunately, he didn't tell us this until later, so it wasn't as meaningful because it's easy to read into things after the fact when you know what was being asked. So that was another lesson learned for us, that it definitely wasn't just the audio that we should be paying attention to. And this was only confirmed by the next experiment we did at our house. The reason we broke out the radio and donned the blindfold and double headphones is because activity in our house had picked up again. After the events at Haunted Antiques, things had calmed right down, and it seemed quite a lot like acknowledgement was all that had ever been wanted. But then one day, Fitz's mum came round while I was at work, and they talked about Jack at length. They even did a bit of research and found out what squadron he was from and where his grave was. Perhaps it was this that woke up our resident ghost, as we started seeing figures in the doorway again, and hearing someone walking around our empty upstairs rooms. So we decided to have another go at communication with our Stranger Things experiment. Fortunately, we also remembered to start a digital recorder running, and we're going to play that recording for you now.
Okay, so Lil's pretty much all set up now, I think.
Oh, crackle, crackle, crackle.
Okay, so was that you? Can you do it again? Are you trying to contact Lil?
Crackle, 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 crackle.
So maybe yes then. If it's you, Jack, can you do it again?
Still crackling.
Okay, and in which case can you stop so that we know it's you?
It stopped.
Hey, Jack. Is there something you wanted to tell us? Specifically? Were you just stopping by to say hello?
Oh. I'm not sure what I heard there. Something deeper and rumbly.
Deep and rumbly. Was it just hello? Was it just, you popping round? Okay, now that you're starting to get the hang of things, we're just going to cut out some of the bits where nothing much really happens. Most of what was happening at this point was me asking questions like, have you got a specific message? Have you got a general message? Do you need me to pass something on to somebody else? And we were getting nothing. And then I asked if he was still there. Okay, Jack, just make it crackle again if you can, just that we know you're still here.
Oh! Crackle. Crackle, crackle.
Okay, definitely you're still here. Are you just having it difficult trying to express what you need to say?
It's like somebody's trying to speak, but I'm just getting the crackle, crackle. So it's like speech, but it's like the intonation and rhythm of speech, but in crackling.
Okay, so it's obviously something that you find it difficult.
It's stopped now.
Yeah, it's something you find it difficult to express in yes and no. Do you find it easier to communicate on some radio frequencies than others? Are we just on the wrong frequency? It's really hard because we can only just get basically yes or no answers from you this way. There's got to be...
Crackle.
Yeah, there's got to be a way that we can get more in-depth information.
Again, at this point, I'm asking questions, trying to see if there's a specific message or if it's a general message. Same sort of thing as last time. Just trying to get any response, and I wasn't getting anything at all until this happened.
Do we need to pass a message to somebody else? Maybe some other family?
I feel like somebody's poking me in the eyes.
Poking you in the
I feel
eyes?
pressure just... Like, not poking me, like tapping me. Like tapping the mask I'm wearing, the blindfold.
Well, I'm not seeing you at the moment, Jack. Are you telling it?
Ah! Big, loud, crackly surge of something.
Are you telling it to take off the blindfold?
I do apologise for yelling, but it was a very loud and sudden noise, and it really surprised me.
Do you just not want us to forget that you're here?
Something white.
White?
Like feathers? Or, I don't know, something. I'm just getting an image.
Okay.
White, I don't know, tips, white wingtips or feathers. Oh, I don't know.
Wingtips?
This session carried on for quite a while after this, but most of what we were getting through, there wasn't any new information. It was just whenever we'd get frustrated and say, oh, you're still there, we're not getting anything through, you'd get a little confirmation and then nothing for a little while. And then, unfortunately, I ended the experiment by knocking everything onto the floor. The radio, the dictaphone. Basically, as I was doing the experiment, I was kind of beginning to feel somebody standing in front of me, which is a little bit disconcerting. And then all of a sudden, it felt like they shot off to my left and there was somebody standing in the hallway, which is often where we see the shadow figures. Bearing in mind, I'm still blindfolded at this point. This is just the sense you get when somebody's close by. And I actually said this out loud and pointed to my left and swept everything, all the equipment, off the table with my arm as I did so. Interestingly, I'd also felt something in that area at the time, so I'd got my phone out and was recording, but I didn't see anything and I didn't capture anything, so... So what I didn't know at the time, though, and this is what blew my mind a bit afterwards, cast your minds back to Haunted Antiques when we were asked if there was a patch or badge missing from our display of Jack's belongings. Well, we both knew that there was, but I had no idea what it looked like. So when I was saying white feathers wingtips, it didn't mean anything to me, but it did to Fitz. After my session, he pulled me over to his computer screen and asked me, "Is this what you saw?" And now, I'm afraid it wasn't, disappointingly. The impressions I had got didn't amount to a fully formed image. It's not like I had the picture of a badge flash into my mind. It was more like components, clues to a puzzle, a bit like that 80s game show catchphrase where you had to say what you saw, say what you see, say what you see. And the description of unrelated images come together to form a catchphrase. White, feather, wingtip. Now what Fitz was showing me was an RAF badge. It was a white, feathered wing embroidered on a patch. And this particular badge would have been part of Jack's RAF uniform.
Not being into military history like Fitz is, or having been present when Fitz and his mum were talking about Jack and doing research, I had no idea that this was, in fact, the very patch that was missing from Jack's belongings. Apparently, the patch used to be displayed with Jack's photograph years ago in Fitz's childhood home, but I'd never seen it. The other thing that didn't occur to me at the time, in fact, the penny didn't drop until I was listening back to the recording whilst putting together this episode, was why I might have had the sensation of someone tapping my eyes through the blindfold. I was struggling to communicate through what I was hearing in the white noise, but almost immediately after I felt someone tapping my eyes was when I started seeing images in my mind's eye that turned out to be the message, white feather wingtip. Was this then someone giving me a hint? A clue? Don't just listen, say what you see.
Now, we said earlier on that we knew we couldn't have been the first people to use radio white noise to attempt to communicate with spirits, and we weren't, although we didn't research the details until later. If you want, you can go down a large-size rabbit hole researching the birth of EVP experiments by Friedrich Jürgensen and Konstantin Raudove, both of whom used radio white noise in their experiments. If you look up Raudove in particular, there's some mind-bending recordings you can find on YouTube that reportedly capture Raudove himself making phone calls from beyond the grave. I know it sounds faintly amusing when I say it like that, but trust me, it's not amusing at all when you hear the recordings and get stuck into the backstory. It makes for some pretty unnerving listening. When I started looking into all of this, I went down the rabbit hole pretty deep myself and turned up a really interesting nugget that I thought might help us in our future experiments. Apparently Jürgensen, one of the grandfathers of EVP experiments, claimed to have narrowed down the most effective frequency to communicate with spirits as being between the frequencies of 1445 and 1500 kHz. There's even a specific frequency known as the Jürgensen frequency, which is 1485 kHz. Eagerly, I jotted this down. Up until now, we'd not tried to do the experiment with any set parameters, and didn't use any set frequencies. Instead, we just dialed through all the different frequencies on any band we fancied until we found one that felt right. And this process was repeated each time we started the experiment. But we could try this. I ran to grab the radio to see if it was possible to tune it to this frequency. Unfortunately, it would be impossible on this little radio to be quite so specific, but as I looked, I noticed where the dial was set after our last experiment. Somewhat unbelievably, considering I'd only just heard about the Jürgensen frequency now, weeks after we'd last used the radio, the dial rested midway between 1400 and 1600 kHz. And that, I'm afraid, is all we have time for this episode. Thank you again to all our patrons and coffee supporters for helping to keep us producing the show, as you are literally the only reason we can do so. If you'd like to support the show, you can do so from as little as $1 a month on Patreon, and you'll get access to some awesome bonus content. If you'd prefer not to commit to a regular payment, you can also support us with a one-off donation through Ko-fi, and links to both Patreon and Ko-fi can be found on our website. Thank you to everyone that shared their stories with us. We really do love hearing them, and sharing those stories with our listeners really is the heart of the show, so keep them coming in. You can share your story by visiting our website at notonceforyes.com.
It's a bit difficult to say how things are going to pan out in future, as it may be a while before we can go out visiting and investigating paranormal locations again, but fear not. We have plenty of ideas for future episodes to keep you entertained until we can go on more adventures. We're also hoping to put out a bit more bonus content, like the little extra video we recently made available on our social media and YouTube channel. Whilst this would normally be reserved for our Patreon-only feed, given the current situation, we wanted to be able to make something that was available to everybody. We hope it provided at least a moment of relief or distraction from current events. We know it's incredibly difficult at the moment, with most of us on lockdown or being isolated, but please don't suffer in silence. Head on over to our Facebook group and join our little community. We really want it to be a supportive and safe place, and we'll do our best to ensure that we're around for a chat as much as possible as well. If any of you are having a hard time with the isolation and need some human conversation, then do get in touch for a virtual coffee with coffee, and we can arrange a good time for a Skype chat. We are thinking of you all during this, and we'll do our best to be here for you should you need us. But for now, take care, guys, and we hope you'll join us next time for another Knock Once for Yes.
If you please listen, then